Hello, Matthew. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you for giving your time and your so precious time, and it's a pleasure to have known you for so many years now, and a second pleasure to have you on the podcast uh, with your vast experience and knowledge. And as a student, I like to learn from a professor, so that's the third pleasure. Matthew is a professor of theology, very interesting area at University of Notre Dame. Uh, he's also very interestingly the chair of Friends of Israel WA. And another interesting thing he does is he's a self-defense instructor in Krav Maga. God, I don't know how you do all that. And even more interesting is he is a snake catcher. Of
Yes.
all the poisonous and non-poisonous snakes, I just stay away from them. That's the only thing I know about snakes. So yeah, welcome, Matthew.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here and an honor to be on your program.
Is there anything you would like to tell more about yourself before we start? Because you have such an interesting persona.
Well, thank you. At least the description is interesting. I'm not sure if I live up to it. I'm also the chairperson of Friends of Israel Western Australia, and I was introduced a few months ago by an interviewer who said that apart from being chair of Friends of Israel, I'm also a self-defence instructor and then I'm a snake catcher, which I think the joke was that those are valuable skills in dealing with anti-Semitism. So it's a little bit
Uh,
naughty, but it sounds good at least. Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Uh, what I wanted to talk to you especially about is the biggest terrorist attack on Australian soil, the Bondi terror attack,
Yes.
and the response to it, the things, what happened after that, especially the big call for a royal commission, which
Yes.
has never happened, as the Prime Minister said, for these kind of terror attacks. So we have, let me start on this. We have heard and read a lot about the Bondi attack in newspapers, in media, in social media. But for listeners, how would you describe what happened at Bondi initially? And why is this even so significant for the Jewish community in particular and nationally across for Australian community as well?
Well, I'll work backwards if I can. Nationally, it's the worst terrorist attack on Australian soil. We've had Australians who were victims of the Bali bombings. That was overseas. And we tend to think of terrorism attacks in this country as things that happen overseas, whether it's in the Middle East, in India, Pakistan, in other countries, in the United States. It's something that is alien to the Australian experience. We just don't think of these things as happening here. For the Jewish community, it hurts extra hard because Jewish people do live in fear. If you go to a synagogue or a Jewish school, there are high fences, there are security measures, there are bollards, there are security personnel. These are things that you don't have at other places of worship. I'm a Roman Catholic. I go to church on a Sunday. I just walk in. No one stops me. There's no security issues. The greatest fear I have is a sermon that will put me to sleep. Not at the parish I go to, of course, but you don't have to worry. Whereas Jewish people, um, when they go to worship on a Sunday, when they take their so on a Saturday, sorry, I got that one wrong. Uh, they go to synagogue, they take their children to school. It's a serious security situation, and that's been going on for way too long. The Bondi terrorist attack was the end of that, if you like. It was specifically anti-Jewish. The terrorists, as far as we know, were specifically targeting Jewish people. It was a Jewish event. It was for Hanukkah, and it is something that has not surprised people, but hurt the Jewish community deeply. Um, there were Jewish people who've been warning about this for a long time. In November, we had a visitor from Israel, Major Itai Gil. He's a member of the Yamam counter-terror unit. He is a counter-terrorism expert. We took him around Western Australia. He was training people. He met members of law enforcement. He met politicians. After that, he turned to me and he said, "You're in deep trouble." He said, "Something is going to happen. If you combine the political environment of this country, the law enforcement environment of this country, with the growing anti-Semitism," he said, "this is going to happen." And it did. So there is a profound sadness, there is grief, there is loss, a sense of abandonment by the Jewish people, but also a sense of inevitability that this thing was coming. And so it's a national tragedy. It's affected everyone. It's been an attack on Australia, and this is very important. Where was the attack? It was an Australian icon. Now, the reality is Western Australia has got better beaches, but the most iconic beach in Australia, the thing that summarises Australian identity, is Bondi Beach. So they selected that very carefully. It was an attack on the Jewish people. It was an attack on Australian society and Australian culture. So it has hurt deeply. What's also hurt is not just the attack, but the response by the government. Now, some people have been marvellous. Unfortunately, the response by the government by the federal government, has left a lot to be desired, to say the least.
You mentioned Hanukkah and Bondi Beach. For someone like coming from India, I understand what living in terror is. When I was a small kid, when I was even in Delhi, the capital of India,
yes,
if we used to travel by bus to school or tuition, there was a line written on the bus, on the top, saying, "Keep an eye under what's under your seat. If there's a transistor or a tiffin box, it might be a bomb." So I've seen those things, and possibly the Jewish community, because they have been airing those fears, they might be living in the same thing. But this happened on a Hanukkah festival.
yes.
So I would request you to explain to people who are not Jewish, what does that festival means? And then what it means that if a terror attack happens when the community is coming together, in a way terrorizing that don't come together, otherwise we'll come for you.
Well, look, Hanukkah is a celebration of a great Jewish victory when Israel had been occupied by a foreign power, and the Jewish people had risen up and defeated the foreign power. And when they had rededicated the temple, they needed to burn the Hanukkah lights, or the lights that we now associate with Hanukkah. They had enough oil, as I understand it, for one day, but they burnt for the entire festival. And so Hanukkah celebrates a miracle of the light, but also the military miracle of a small nation being able to be victorious over an occupying power. So Hanukkah is a celebration of victory, a celebration of hope. It's joyful, and it's a coming together for Jewish people to celebrate the fact that they put up with an awful lot of persecution, but in the end they're victorious. And so the attack at Bondi was not just an attack on a gathering, but it was an attack on a gathering which was meant to be unity. It was meant to be joyful. It was meant to be a celebration. And that was the really horrible thing about the attack, that it was specifically aimed at Jewish people at such a happy event.
Now knowing about that Hanukkah festival, I think it is very relevant to the Australian community itself, because we are also a nation of very small population, 23, 24 million. Our army is not that big. Our ADF is not that big. And we are surrounded by China, and we are stuck between China and US in a way. We might be part of all these Quad and things, but we have ultimately our sovereignty and our security is in our hands. So we are kind of that situation, and it has a good relevance for us. But moving forward, when the attack happened, what are you hearing from the Jewish community in WA? What are people thinking here?
Well, the reality is that many people in the Jewish community here have got relatives or friends in the community over east. It's a very connected community, being rather small. Everyone knows each other, or at least knows someone who knows someone. So there's that direct connection. In fact, I was at a Hanukkah celebration here in Perth at the time, and I received a phone call from a friend of mine who was asking what the heck is happening at Bondi. I had no idea, but he said my brother-in-law is there, and he survived mercifully. So look, people know each other, and if they don't know people directly, they know of them. So there's that personal connection. There's also the community connection. The terrorists were sending a message that they're not just attacking individuals. So this wasn't like the Lynn Cafe siege. This was specifically against Jewish people. It was designed to strike fear and terror into the hearts of all Jewish people. So it was felt deeply. That was the immediate feeling. And this is the essence of terrorism. I mean, terrorism is something I've been studying as an academic for, well, actually over 2 decades now, longer than I care to admit. The essence of terrorism is not killing people. It's creating the terror of what will happen next. And that's regardless of what sort of terrorism it is. 9/11 was probably a prominent example where the Twin Towers were hit, the Pentagon was hit. And it wasn't just the fact that those targets have been hit, but people are wondering what comes next. And that was something I heard a lot from the Jewish community here. People have been killed in Bondi. What is happening next? And that's where the disappointment came in. Because, look, the reality is law enforcement in this state is very good. They look after the Jewish community quite well. And the government of the day, whether it's Liberal or Labor, has been very good in this state of looking after Jewish people. I can't say that for the East Coast. There's a great sense that Bondi happened because the government had ignored Jewish people, marginalised them, not listened to them. And so in the face of one terror attack, the feeling was, well, what's next? This government has not looked after us. What's it going to do now? And people were very, very worried. So there are all these feelings of grief, of anxiety, of terror, and a sense of abandonment by the people who are supposed to look after them. And that was felt all at once. So the community here was absolutely shaken up.
The biggest discussion after the attack was, and the demand from the community was to have a royal commission into this incident. The government has been giving examples on examples and reasons why we shouldn't have one. And now on 8th of January, the Prime Minister has agreed to have a royal commission. But the very first thing that we hear from the community and expressed by the ex-treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, is that it is inconceivable to choose a commissioner who does not have the total confidence of the Jewish community. Given the Justice Bell's background, do you share this concern? What the concerns are in the community? Is it that the review or the outcome would be a more progressive analysis of social cohesion versus a forensic look into the radicalization and the reasons why Bondi happened?
Sure. Look, I think the initial reaction against the Royal Commissioner was probably born not of herself, but of a basic distrust of the Prime Minister. For me, that seemed to be the biggest driver. And look, I know, for example, that there were great criticisms of her, but then the general feeling is, all right, she's been appointed, let's see how things work. So the criticisms of the Commissioner are not about her. But I mean, the reality is the Prime Minister had been dragged kicking and screaming into a Royal Commission. He's been arguing and saying no to it for so long. The Jewish community and probably most Australians don't trust the Prime Minister on this. The Prime Minister is a well-known long-term advocate for Palestine. There's a picture out there that you can see when he was younger. He met Yasser Arafat. He looked like a child in a candy shop. He was so happy to meet him. He's been at other pro-Palestine events. The Jewish community don't particularly trust him because of that and because of his lack of action since October 7. So I think that has coloured the response. I think that the general feeling now is that when people think about it, I mean, Royal Commissioners are, yes, they're appointed by the government of the day, but they have their own power and they tend to surprise us. And I think that's one reason why Anthony Albanese did not want a Royal Commission, because he cannot control the Royal Commission once it's established. So there's a sense that people should trust the Commissioner, they should trust the process. They are highly, highly sceptical of the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet. But there's a sense of relief that a Royal Commission with all its powers has been called, and there is hope that the truth will emerge. And so it's basically at the moment it's a case of wait and see.
With the Royal Commission, there's two important things. One is that the government has rolled in the Richardson Review into security agencies into this Royal Commission. The second is that the government has crunched the timeline. You have to give a report by 14th of December. Do you think these two things combined puts a lot of overload into the commission and it would not be able to analyze and review and give a sound, considered report, rather than it will be a rush-through report which benefits the government?
I think that the reality is that you want a rigorous and thorough inquiry, but you want to give it the time necessary to gather everything that it needs to. I think in this case that if the Royal Commission does its job well, look, there are some things that are absolutely obvious that it will uncover very quickly. So anti-Semitism in the community, that will be very, very straightforward. What will be less straightforward is uncovering the lack of response in the government. What will be controversial is the two-tier approach to law enforcement that we have in this country. The question of why some undesirable people have been deported but not others. What will be more challenging, I think, and of course I'm only predicting here. As I said, Royal Commissions have a habit of surprising us, but looking at the law enforcement and intelligence failures. So, for example, one of the terrorists at least was on the radar of ASIO. Now, why did he drop off the radar? Was that because of a mistake that was made? Was it because of a lack of resources? Why was it at the policing level that someone who'd been investigated by ASIO was allowed to have a firearms license? Now, these are questions that need to be asked and answered. And I think those ones will be the hardest ones to work through. So I think the reality is we need answers and we need them as quickly as possible. But we can't rush something like this because it has to be thorough. I think that the timeline, like the Prime Minister may have had his own motivations. I'm not sure what they were. But I think that a Royal Commission does have the time to achieve what it's been commissioned to do. The main thing is that it's got the resources, and that's the really important thing.
Uh, I won't bother to you too much on Royal Commission. One of the things which Minister Burke said when they were saying no to the Royal Commission was that if you have the Royal Commission, all these people will come and have another say during the proceedings, and it will platform hate from both sides. Now that the Royal Commission is here, do you think that risk is still there, or that was just an exaggeration?
I would be very sceptical of that claim. Look, I think that members of the government have been very desperate to avoid a Royal Commission, and I certainly don't accept what Minister Burke said there. The reality is that an effective Royal Commission will be open to submissions from all sorts of people, and it will certainly be able to ensure that hateful people don't have a platform. So, look, I disagree strongly with the Minister there.
The Royal Commission will have its report whenever it happens, but from your experience of teaching theology and working with the community, what do you think are the key drivers of this attack? Is it radical ideology, online incitement, failure of intelligence, or something else?
Oh, look, I think all of the above. The intelligence failed. In what way it failed, we're not sure yet. Online radicalisation, that's become part of the terrorist scene for some time now. And look, Islamic State is very good, well, I should say very effective at online radicalisation. In terms of the ideology, and this is the thing that people don't want to address, the reality is that there is a radical extreme ideology out there. It's a religious ideology, and that's what was behind this. Now, this raises a deeper problem with society. In Western societies, especially Australia, we don't talk about religion. It's this great taboo. You don't talk about religion in polite company. But we remain ignorant of religion then. And it means that we can't talk about radical Islam. That's a problem. It also means we can't talk about moderate Islam. And so what I found in my decades of working in the field is that people are afraid to confront radical Islam head on. But because of that, they are incapable of distinguishing radical Islam from moderate Islam. And, and the reality is that the crushing majority of Muslims are not terrorists. They don't support terrorism. They may have political viewpoints, but most Muslims are absolutely appalled by what happened at Bondi. And the reality is that one of the heroes of Bondi was himself a Muslim. But there is a small number, and they are a minority, of radicals, of extremists, who have been radicalised online by hate preachers, and they are motivated by this radical extremism to go out there and kill people. And our failure to deal with that was one of the drivers behind the Bondi massacre. And I've got to say, I've been disappointed, to say the least, with media figures and law enforcement figures who've said, this has got nothing to do with religion. Now, I've been hearing this for decades. It's got nothing to do with religion. And I said, well, okay, 9/11, Al-Qaeda. a radical Muslim organization, Hamas, the Islamic resistance, Hezbollah, the party of God, Islamic State, it's in the name. It doesn't represent mainstream Islam, and that's a very important point to make, but it does represent extremist Islam, and we've been too afraid to deal with it, afraid for different reasons. And so that was a key driver in the attack, and it's something that we've been afraid of dealing with and incapable of dealing with because people don't understand it and they fear it. And there's actually there's another side to this. When I talk with people in the Islamic community who are moderates, and they complain privately, of course, they said, because you guys don't deal with the extremists, because you don't understand the extremists, because you won't confront the extremists, we feel powerless because we're unprotected. And if we're critical of the extremists, we wonder, will the government protect us? So I think that we've been living on this heavy dose of political correctness and ignorance for so long that we've been afraid to deal with this wicked ideology that has come and hit us pretty hard. And I'll just say one more thing on that. When I did my counter-terror fellowship in the Middle East, this is some time ago, one of the leaders asked me a question. He said, Matthew, who are the first victims of terrorism in this world, of Islamic terrorism? And some people in the group said, oh, Jews. Others said Christians. And he said, it's fellow Muslims. And this is something when I was talking to someone who'd been very closely involved in Hamas. The thing that had turned this guy against Hamas was seeing the way that Hamas, an extremist Sunni sect, had treated their fellow Muslims. And so perhaps there's a lesson here. I mean, Australia is multicultural. We're a land that believes in the protection of all people. The fact that we cannot protect our Christian, our Jewish, our Sikh community, people of any religion, also means we can't protect moderate Muslims. It's an all-round failure. And this failure was what resulted in the Bondi attack. So, look, I realise that I sound like I'm on a high horse there, but this is a key driver that we have ignored to our great peril.
You talked about all these groups. The Bondi attack has been linked to a call for global Intifada. Can you help us understand this concept of Intifada, and do you agree with the linkages of Intifada to the Bondi attack?
Look, I agree 100%. The terrorist organisations that are inspired or motivated by Islamic extremism generally tie themselves to the Palestinian cause, and that's any number of terrorist groups. Whether they authentically represent the Palestinian people, I would dispute, but they claim that. And look, all of these groups are anti-Semitic. They all hate Jewish people. And the way that they legitimise that is by saying they're pro-Palestinian. And so globalise the Intifada means different things to different people, but it essentially means that any of these extremist groups will claim that Intifada mantle, if you like, to justify their attacks. And perhaps if I could expand on that a little bit, what a lot of people don't realise is that this sort of Intifada, this struggle against Israel, is not just a struggle against Israel as a nation, but it's a struggle against the Jewish people in general. So if you look, for example, at Hamas, the group responsible for October 7 and many, many other atrocities, if you look at the founding covenant of Hamas, and this is easily available on the internet, it refers to the resistance, it refers to the struggle, it refers to their hatred for the Fatah, for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Well, when it talks about the Jews, it talks about the day of judgment, which won't come until the Muslims kill all the Jews. You know, they say that on this great day, the stones and the trees will cry out, "O Muslim, O servant of God, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill them." Importantly, not Israelis, but Jews. The aim of Hamas is not just to take over the Holy Land from the river to the sea, it's to kill every Jew on the planet. Let me expand that. On the steps of the Opera House, after October 7, and before the full force of the Israeli response, people were chanting. Now, people dispute, gas the Jews or where's the Jews? I think they were saying gas the Jews. I mean, it's a stretch to say it was where's the Jews. But in a way, it doesn't matter, because the crowd was not shouting, we hate Israel, or where are the Israelis? They were crying, where's or gas the Jews? So this whole Intifada thing is a mantle taken on by terrorists who are anti-Semitic, and they use that as a justification for their actions. So, what we saw at Bondi was certainly part of that globalization, that terrorists will claim their solidarity with the Palestinian cause and use that as their justification for their atrocities.
You mentioned about the Opera House and all those protests. How much do you think those climate of protests on Sydney Opera House, on universities, because you work in universities, on social media, at rallies, it has created that environment that if something happens, it's permissible?
Well, look, I'll preface this by saying I'm actually rather proud of my own university at Notre. I'm not just saying that because I want to give my university a shout out, but the leadership there has been very, what's the word? They've been keen, they've been sincere in making sure that all students on campus are safe. And at the moment, the safety of Jewish students and staff has been a great concern. So they've been terrific. The sad thing is there are universities in our state and others where Jewish students have not been safe. They've had these encampments, they've had anti-Semitic staff, they've had anti-Semitic students. You had an example at UWA, this was a bit over a year ago, where there was, part of this Palestinian struggle call for boycott, divest and sanction, at which one of the speakers called for a one-state solution, which is Hamas code for kill the Jews. And someone was caught on video calling for the camps to be reopened, as in the concentration camps. That's created a really horrible atmosphere. You've got Curtin University, where you've had the camps, the tent protests, whatever you want to call them. Staff have felt unsafe, students have felt unsafe. The fact that those were not shut down has created a lot of fear in the Jewish community and fear from people who are just everyday, ordinary Australians. But the failure to shut it down has also emboldened people. The bad actors will look at the universities and say, hey, we've taken an inch, we've been given a mile, and this is the nature of extremism. It has to be more and more extreme. So I think that by allowing these things, there's been a great failure in the community. which has emboldened people to take the next step. And the reality is that, look, universities are always places of protest. Whether it's for the rights of one group or another, whether it's for the environment or this cause or another. And that's part of university life. But those things don't preach hatred. And that's the difference here. That at some university campus, they have allowed rallies, protests, camps that have promoted hatred and a threat to people. And as I've said, if I could put it another way, in the first place, it makes people on campus feel very, very unsafe. But also those who might be, who might have ill intent, look at those and think, well, we've got a license to take it the next step. So universities, I do think they've got to bear some responsibility here. As I've said, Notre Dame has been fantastic. And without exaggerating, I've had Jewish people come up to me and say, isn't it ironic that the campus at which my children feel safest as Jews is a Catholic university? That's great. The tragedy is that they don't feel safe on other campuses.
While all these protests were happening on ground, what do you think the role was played by the foreign media and social media in ramping up these divisions, especially when the media reiterates the number of deaths in Palestine given out by Hamas? Because the government is controlled by Hamas there. So how do you see that their role?
Well, I absolutely. There's the expression that the first casualty in war is truth. And I think what's come out of Gaza is certainly exemplifies that. The Hamas health ministry figures were taken as gospel truth by many people in the media. Look, to be honest, a lot of people in the media are not very sympathetic to Israel. And so it has suited their agenda to take on those figures. But then that's amplified through social media. So we see some things through traditional media. But look, many people today, I believe 40% of people get their news through social media. Social media doesn't have the same safety mechanism, if you like, or quality control that you're meant to find in traditional media. So you get people who get onto a Facebook page or a website and they're fed information that whips them up into a frenzy. And look, one of the important things about social media is that I understand the algorithms of social media are designed to generate conflict. This was, and perhaps for legal reasons, I won't mention which one, but a very prominent social media network set its algorithms to foster conflict, because conflict builds engagement. Engagement builds advertising revenue. And look, just try that sometime. If you post something positive on social media, you might get a couple of likes. Post something that is angry, something that is hateful, and people will engage immediately. So I'm not saying post stuff that's hateful, but maybe look at what other people post. Or just tell people you disagree and look at the response. So social media is designed, in my opinion, to generate conflict. And when you have a situation such as Israel and Hamas, social media tends to whip that up and aggravate it rather than to seek peaceful solutions. So, look, social media has been absolutely horrible, and there have been foreign influences as well. We see, for example, the action taken against the Iranian embassy when it became clear that the Iranians, the current regime in Iran, God willing, they'll be gone soon, were actively fostering terrorism in Australia. Now I haven't verified these claims, but when people said to me, Matthew, look at the tents at some of these tent protests. How can students afford those? Because they're very, very expensive tents, and they're the same model. And the allegation has been made that there is foreign influence and foreign money behind this. So that's something that I hope the Royal Commission will uncover, is that I think we are aware to an extent of foreign influence and foreign money, but how deep does that run? And that really, look, there are rumours, there are stories, there are theories, and I think they really need to be tested. We know for a fact Iran has tried to and has successfully fostered hatred and crime in this country. The question is, and I raise this as a question or an accusation, what other foreign actors have been involved? Hopefully the Royal Commission will uncover that.
Still on to that, the background for this attack. I came to Australia in 2014. I've counted the number of attacks since then. There have been 11 attacks. Out of those, 9 were IS inspired. And every time we hear the response from the police agencies, they always come back and say it was a lone wolf attack. There's no continued or no support for the attacker or the terrorist from anyone else. The AFP has said in this Bondi terror attack the same thing. They were acting alone. There was no broader support. If that happens every time and there is a continuous attack from the same side, do you think the police agencies or the security agencies are missing something here?
Well, look, the reality is that I think maybe we can throw some light on this by comparing Al-Qaeda to Islamic State. The best known attack of Al-Qaeda was 9/11, and that was their own people who were well funded, trained for a long time in a very effectively planned attack. Al-Qaeda would work by this careful planning, selection of the terrorists, and it was very much their work. Islamic State, in terms of international terrorism, has worked differently. It influences people, it inspires people, and they have been very effective in inspiring lone wolf attacks. So it's the next phase of terrorism, if you like. And look, there were, because Islamic State emerged out of Al-Qaeda. There were differences of opinion within Al-Qaeda back when bin Laden was alive. Bin Laden wanted a very carefully managed organization with carefully managed attacks. There were others within the organization who said, look, we should just inspire people, throw the information out there and let people do whatever they want. And that's what Islamic State has done. And so you've got, to call it lone wolf, the Link Cafe siege was lone wolf, inspired by Islamic State. Bondi was lone wolf, inspired by Islamic State. The people are alone in terms of the people, but not by the ideology. And that's an important thing. Ideology is crucial here. When people encounter that ideology, and look, the reality is there are lots of people with access to that. Anyone on a home computer now can access Islamic State material and be radicalized. They may not even know they're reading material from Islamic State. You may have 100 people, 1,000 people who are exposed to the ideology, but maybe only 1 or 2 will actually take that step to committing acts of terror. But that's the reality. You only need one or two people to do it. So I think that one of the problems with policing, law enforcement, and the military around the world, so it's not uniquely Australian, is that we have the mentality of criminal organisations and nations and conventional armies and conventional criminals working in particular ways. And that's what our people have been trained for. But contemporary terrorism breaks all of those rules. You know, even it comes down to the motivation for terrorism. It's not motivated by power or money. It's motivated by ideology. It's very different to conventional warfare, where you have armies who work under a general who work in a particular way. Terrorism is something that works very effectively with radicalized individuals. So what we should be doing about that is that this sort of stuff is unfamiliar to many people in law enforcement and in some agencies. I noticed that Israel actually offered their expertise to Australia because Israel, of necessity, is probably the most expert country in the world. And I think we need to be taking advantage of that. I highlighted my friend Major Itai Gill, who looked at Australia and told me something bad is going to happen. And this is what you need to change. And now Israel has offered its help. I think we should accept that to learn from their experience. And look, the reality is Australia is different to Israel. We have maybe different threats, but they're related. And we need to bring our people up to date. And also, I've got to say, resourced. When I talk to people in law enforcement privately, and they're just marvelous people. And sometimes, well, they're well trained, they're committed. We don't have the resources to do what we should be doing. So we need the expertise, we need the resources, and we need a government with the courage to do that.
Now that the attack has happened and the government came out with a lot of measures to tackle or after the attack, security, policing, mental health support, how do you see those measures? Were they sufficient? What does the community think about those support measures? And one of the biggest thing was that the government provided more armed policemen security around Jewish establishments and events. Do you think now that's a norm of life going forward?
Look, I think security around Jewish establishments has been needed for a long time, whether it's the police or the community security group. That's a reality of life. Now that we've had one terrorist attack, the reality is, and this is my great fear, is that there'll be copycats. And so we do need enhanced policing. I've got to say, in Western Australia, the police here have done a remarkably good job. Whenever I've gone to a Jewish gathering or a gathering of friends of the Jewish people, I've always felt very safe. The security measures have been top rate. The police have been adequately trained and equipped, and that's been terrific. We should learn from the experience of Bondi. There was a gathering of Jewish people at a time when tensions have been running very high and threats have been made. Did we have enough police present? And did the police have the equipment and the training to respond to that immediately? The Royal Commission will give us some answers there. I'll say one thing if I can, that the first response was firearm law reform. And I don't know how to put this diplomatically, but that was just a distraction. Yes, the terrorists used firearms. They also had explosive devices which they weren't able to use. But the reality is that the firearm laws already, the ones that were already in existence, meant that those guys should not have been licensed. If you're on ASIO's radar for extremism, you should not have a firearms license. So the problem was not the lack of law, but the problem was lack of law enforcement. And it's sad, it's frustrating that the first substantial measure taken after Bondi was to distract people's attention from the real issues. And the firearms were blamed for the actions of the people who carried them. Or as I'd put it, the problem is not the trigger, the problem is the finger on it. And at the same time, if you look at the contemporary context, IEDs are straightforward to construct. I'm not going to say how, but they are. You can produce your own firearms nowadays. Anyone can do that. Firearms are easy to obtain illegally. That's a reality. So none of these laws are going to stop what happened at Bondi. It's all a smokescreen. What will prevent something like Bondi again is adequate law enforcement and a change of culture. And that response, some people have realised that, and the federal government has not realised that yet. So, unfortunately, I may be too harsh in my assessment of the Prime Minister, but I think that too much was devoted to avoiding the blame that he deserved and his government. And I do think they need to be condemned for that. Instead of dealing with the issues, admitting fault, and committing to substantially respond to the threat, was all about covering their rear ends, which was why they resisted a Royal Commission for so long. So we've got a lot of work to do, and our federal government has a lot of catching up to do.
Two questions from there. The first is that the father attacker, I think both of them had gun for the last 10 years. The gun access to gun or gun license for the last 10 years. But they decided to use the guns in a terrorist fashion or attack only now. So they were safe. The guns were safe in their hands for the last 8-9 years. They only switched now. By focusing only on the guns, are we making a mistake that we are not going for the root cause why they switched, but instead just focusing on gun laws and punishing the innocent gun owners for which they have done nothing and they were not even involved anyway?
Well, you're absolutely right there. And look, if you look to the Israelis, I remember listening to an Israeli security expert who was asked, it's been so long since an LL jet has been hijacked. Israeli security is very, very good. And if you ever fly to Israel, you know this. And he was asked, why are you guys successful compared to other nations? And he didn't want to say it at first, but he was pressed. He said, look, the difference between Israel and other countries is, he said, they look for weapons, we look for terrorists. And the reality is that, you know, firearms are used by farmers, they're used by people who help farmers, they're used by sportsmen and sportswomen. They're not the problem. The problem is the terrorists who will use a firearm, they'll use a bomb, they'll use a vehicle. Look at Europe, where vehicles have been used to kill many, many people. So terrorists will innovate. If they can't use a machine gun, they'll build a bomb, they'll drive a truck. look at the Oklahoma City bombing, for example. The Tim McVeigh. He killed how many people with an improvised bomb? So the reality is that blaming it on the tool rather than terrorists is a huge mistake. And I think, well, not a mistake, it's been used consciously to distract people from the real issues. So, the poor firearm owners who just want to do their job, do their service, enjoy their sport, they're suffering because they've been scapegoated for the actions of others. And as I said, it's a distraction. And I'm very, very disappointed in people who are pursuing that line or changing the legislation. I can guarantee you one thing, as far as terrorism is concerned, none of those new laws are going to stop terrorism. None of them. All it will do is perhaps make the tools a little bit harder to obtain. But I can tell you, I've been studying terrorism since the 1990s. If I wanted to commit an act of mass casualty terrorism, none of those new laws would make a difference. So we need visionary leadership, we need courageous leadership in our government to do the right thing rather than distract people and punish the innocent.
One of the criticism of the government on whatever it did or the responses was that the response was more towards concern of managing or maintaining or increasing its vote base in Muslim dominated constituencies rather than confronting the radical Islamist ideology. I think it was Ben Harvey who said it in his video on the West as well. How do you think, if that is the calibration, how do you think it will affect the policing and the policy making after the attack?
Well, I'll say one thing about that. It is a belief in Labor circles, but what an insult to the Muslim people that their vote is taken for granted. I mean, Muslim people think for themselves. Muslim people have their own priorities and their own thoughts, and to be taken for granted by any political party is, I think if I was a Muslim, I'd be supremely insulted. Just as if a party said, oh, because you're Catholic, you're going to vote for me. Where that came from is that years ago, and this is decades ago, the Labor Party came to believe in Western Sydney that if they supported Sheikh Yalali, the head Muslim cleric, that if they supported him, that his people would always vote Labor. Now, there are different versions of that, but what is certainly true is that the authorities wanted to deport him. He was anti-Western, he was anti-Jewish. If you remember, he's the guy who blamed gang rape on the victims. He used the image of, if you have uncovered meat in the driveway, who can blame the animals for eating it? He was a horrible person, and certainly not representative of most Muslims. But key Labor figures felt that if they allowed him to stay and formed an alliance with him, that his people would always vote Labor. And I think because of that, because that myth is still very strong, that many people in Labor feel that if they do anything to do with Islam, that they're going to lose votes in Western Sydney and other electorates. Now, I do think that Labor is mistaken there. If you look at, if you look at real Islam and not the Islam of the Labor Party, and especially the Labor left, if you look at family life, if you look at the values of solid morality, dedication to family and community, I don't think Muslim people blindly vote Labor, no less than any other community. But it doesn't matter what Muslims actually think, it's what Labor thinks about Muslims. And there are Labor people who get it, but there are enough people in Labor, leaders in Labor, especially those in government, who think that if they do what's necessary, they're going to lose votes. And I think that's one reason why the Prime Minister has been so reluctant to act, because he's afraid that he will lose a block of votes. And that has paralysed an effective response to Bondi. So, look, the short thing is, I think Labor takes Muslim people for granted. It misunderstands Muslim people. And that misunderstanding and that taking the Muslim vote for granted has led to some dreadful policy directions. It's just my opinion, but I think I'm right.
Another peculiar marking of the Prime Minister's speeches after the attack was that every time someone asked him about radical ideology, he'll always mention the risks from the far right. It's always there.
Yes.
Every time he talks about anti-Semitism, is always a mention of Islamophobia. It's almost like he's trying to balance or counterbalance everything, trying to take everyone with him. What do you think of that balancing act? And how do you think, or how seriously do you think is the risk, actual risk from far right anti-Semitism or far right extremism to Australia?
Look, I think one problem is quantifying the threat. There is a threat from the far right. That's a reality, and that's been a reality for many years. But to ignore one threat because there's another, and to deflect attention from one threat because it's not politically expedient, that's wrong. And I think what the Prime Minister has been doing is essentially deflecting attention from his own failures. Now, the far right, and I'll go out on a limb here, there is no room in Australia for Nazism. It's firmly against Australian values. So I would support the deportation of non-citizens who are Nazis. I mean, if you're going to preach that sort of genocidal hatred, goodbye, you're gone. But the same thing should apply to people who preach that sort of hatred, people who support genocide, regardless of whether it's right-wing or religious or whatever. And the reality is that we know people who've been preaching this hatred from a religious perspective. We know that they've been chanting, "Gas the Jews, where's the Jews?" that sort of thing. Have one of those people been deported? None. So what we've got here is a two-tier approach where people from one part of the political spectrum, the far right, they're being justifiably deported, and I actually support that. But others are not. And I do think that, taking it all the way to the Prime Minister is because there's this fear that he will aggravate part of his voter base. I think the reality is that, knowing moderate Muslims, if there are people who are preaching this sort of hatred in Australia, moderate Muslims would actually be happier if these guys were gone, because they don't represent normal mainstream Islam. But for some reason, this fear, this ignorance, the two-tier approach has meant that they haven't been dealt with. So, it's partly ignorance, it's partly a failure, and it has paralysed our response to these violent ideologies.
One of the peculiar thing in this context is that the Jewish community is in the center of both the sides. ISIS-inspired extremists are attacking Jewish, and the far right extremists are attacking Jewish. How is the community taking this
Yes.
attack from both sides, and what should the government be actually doing to manage the threat from two sides?
Well, this is a real. This is history. If you look, for example, at the history of the Holy Land, Israel Palestine. If you look at the Third Reich, you had the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, who was the Muslim leader in Jerusalem, who really opposed the Jews. He encouraged people to fight against the Jews, to kill Jews in the Holy Land. But with the rise of Hitler and Nazism, he made allies of the Nazis. So he met leaders of the Third Reich. He met Hitler himself. Hitler said, "The Jews are yours." Al-Husseini asked for the technologies to deal with the Jews, the poison gas and that sort of thing. He recruited many Muslim soldiers for the SS. He became known as Hitler's Mufti for that reason. Now, these are strange bedfellows, the white supremacist Nazis forming an alliance with an Arab Muslim. Well, what unites them? Anti-Semitism. It's an example of my enemy's enemy being my friend. And this sort of thing is history. It's a present reality. The far right and the extremist Muslims hate each other. White supremacists hate extremist Muslims, and the opposite is true. But they're united by anti-Semitism. And the Jewish people, unfortunately, are in the middle of this. The reality at the moment, though, is that the far right is a threat and has been a threat for a long time. But the greatest threat at the moment is radical extremist Islam. And I think that both threats have to be taken seriously. Both threats have to be dealt with. People who are far right or radical, religiously motivated anti-Semites, if they're not citizens, they should be deported. If they are citizens, they should be charged with the appropriate crimes and dealt with. Having said that, law enforcement is part of this, but more importantly, it's culture. And I do think we need to rebuild a culture in which these things are unthinkable. We need to have a culture in which we respect each other, all people are equal, we have a fair go for everyone. And that if someone gets up and says, we hate the Jews, whether they're motivated by Nazi ideology or an extremist version of religion, that the community should push back on that. And that's going to take time, it's going to take investment, and it's going to take real leadership in government that we're not seeing at the moment. So the short thing is, and I've done research in both fields. So in the 1990s, I was researching Christian fundamentalist violent extremism in North America. It's real. But then after 9/11, I also brought into Islamic terrorism. The mistake that we can make is to look at one threat or another. The reality is that both are a threat and they have to be dealt with appropriately. Our government is not doing that.
Apart from the gun laws, the other response from the government, both at federal and New South Wales, is clamping down more on the hate speech laws. As a self-defense trainer and defender of democratic rights, how do you balance the need for security with the protection of free speech? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I like what a US Supreme Court justice said many years ago now. Free speech doesn't give you the right to go to a crowded theatre and call out fire. The question is, look, free speech should be speech that is truthful, speech that is responsible, speech that respects the rights of other people. So we do have a problem with conceiving free speech in this society. A lot people mistake free speech with being able to say whatever you want to, even if it's harmful. We could have a long debate about what constitutes free speech or not, but the line is somewhere at the point of being harmful. So if I say, I don't like the policies of this country or that country, I don't like the policies of this other party, and I explain why, that's free speech. But if I start encouraging people to do harm to people from that other country, to say that people from country X are bad, we should kill them, then that's no longer free speech, that's harm speech. And I'm not just talking about hurtful words there. I mean, you might say something that upsets people. I don't agree with your politics. I don't agree with your religion. I don't agree with your lifestyle. Well, fine, we should all be grown up and be able to deal with that sort of stuff. But it's when someone says, I want you dead, or I want you harmed, I want criminal acts committed against you, then that crosses a line. And I think we really need to understand that. And look, long term, because this is the big problem with Section 18, with 18C, it's the problem with free speech in general. People don't really understand what free speech is. That's a long-term conversation. In the short term, we should appreciate that people can follow whatever religion, whatever political philosophy, whatever they want to. But they can't be out there in public encouraging people to hurt each other. And we need to respond to that resolutely and firmly. And that again requires leadership that we are not seeing from our government.
Matthew, the next thing, another problem that people have with those free speech laws is that the restricting of the hate speech is that now they won't be able to criticize the government policy or even the criticism of Israel. How do you respond to that concern?
Look, I think that those sorts of concerns would be valid in a totalitarian society. But I do think that, we're a long way from that in this country. And I think that Australian culture is strong enough that if any government tried to impose those sorts of restrictions, that we would resist it. So I do think those sorts of laws, any laws, can be abused by a government that is not democratic. But I think Australian culture is too strong for that to occur. The moment that the government tried to shut down authentic free speech, that government would be in serious trouble.
One of the forms of freedom of speech is the protests. And we have seen the protests near synagogues or Jewish schools or suburbs with high Jewish populations or Jewish businesses. Do you think it is time that we need to allow protests? We have an earmarked area where you can have your protests. The protest should not trample the rights of the other people who are just going about their lives.
Well, that's right. Look, the reality is people have a right to protest. They've got a right to assemble. They don't have a right to make other people feel unsafe or threatened. So, for example, when we had the anti-Israel protesters outside a Jewish school, common sense would tell you that innocent primary school children would be frightened by that sort of thing. So, look, I think common sense should come into play here. If people want to have their chants and have their protests and all that sort of thing, they can do it, but not in a way that makes people feel unsafe. So I think, look, especially at the moment when things are so tense, when Jewish people feel threatened for very good reason, then protests near houses of worship or schools or institutions are likely to threaten people, and they need to be somewhere else. And of course, I'd add to that, if these protests are expressing hate speech, calling for the death of people and all that, then they cross the line and those protests should not be allowed. And people promoting hate speech should be arrested and charged.
We talked about the protests and encampments in universities. There is a viewpoint that those protests have gone beyond the reasonable exchange of ideas in universities, and it is high time that the government strips the funding from these universities if those kind of protests are happening at universities, because there are other students who go to universities and they just want to go and study.
Well, that's right. So, look, at universities, you should have a free exchange of ideas. And I'll use my own university as an example. I have students, I have colleagues who are pro-Palestinian, and they may wear a Palestinian flag pin or other things, and we have a free exchange of ideas. That's great. But universities that have allowed one side to dominate and people to be fearful, where students are afraid to be on campus, where staff are afraid to be on campus, where people have felt threatened, then I'm very sympathetic to those students, to the universities losing their funding. Look, universities should be places of truth. They should be places that foster responsible citizenship. And if the universities are not doing that job, then the question is, why are they there? And should they be funded by the taxpayer? So I wouldn't go so far as to say they should be stripped of their funding or accreditation yet, but we need to look at that very seriously. Looking at it worldwide, I find it very interesting that many of the campuses that have the worst examples of anti-Semitism are also campuses that have the lowest standards of teaching, where ideology has overtaken the pursuit of truth. I'm not going to name them in public, but we know who we're talking about. And here's the question: should governments and charitable foundations be pouring billions of dollars into institutions that have low standards of teaching, that don't teach truth, but which foster ideology? And I think that we need to have a serious talk about that. I know that there are good people in Australia who are having a more positive version of that conversation. But look, the reality is there are so many of these protesters who are university students who are chanting from the river to the sea. Great. That's a legitimate political viewpoint with which I disagree. But then you ask them, which river, which sea? And the responses sometimes are embarrassing as someone in the field of education, where people are not expressing free speech, but they're giving voice to ignorance. And so why do we have these institutions? So I think that we need to, especially in this country, have a conversation. To what extent is anti-Semitism accompanied or caused by a lack of education? As I said, there's free speech, there's academic freedom. That's great. But are we promoting academic freedom, or are we amplifying ignorance? And we've got to look at that very seriously. maybe to put a perspective on that, there's some excellent work that's been done by the Institute of Public Affairs and the work of Bella Drebera, for example. Um, she did a study of history programs around Australian universities, and I don't have the exact number offhand, so I'm afraid of misquoting. But out of dozens of history programs, I think it was less than half a dozen of them actually dealt with proper history. The rest we could categorize as grievance studies. So you have students who are going to a university getting a history degree and not really knowing history. Now, here's the question, and then they go out and they have these, they chant slogans and they chant death to Israel, river to the sea, all this, that sort of stuff. Well, people spoke to me about that and they laughed. They said, that's stupid. And I said, don't laugh. Your taxes are paying for this. So I think what we should have, and I've said in another forum, that the answer to anti-Semitism, is it government, is it law enforcement, is it education, is it migration? It's the whole thing. It's a whole culture approach. And part of that is education. We need to look seriously at education in this country to ask, are we teaching truth or are we imposing ideology? And I would hope to see the next government look at that very seriously. That may be a controversial thing to say, but I think it's the reality. We spend how many billion dollars on universities? Are we getting our money's worth?
I think there is a cost component because when I did my master's in project management in 2017, I did it in, the total cost was I think $45,000. Today it's $90,000. Same cost. So the cost to the government is also expanding with no benefit to the community. So something to think of.
Look, I agree. And look, I've written on universities in other contexts, so I could go on about this for hours, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But the reality is that university education has become very expensive. I think one reason is that we're not prioritising good teaching where we have other priorities. That has been the fault of past governments. And so I think governments need to look at their priorities for education and ask ourselves, what are we doing at universities and are we getting our money's worth? Are the taxpayers getting their money's worth? Are students getting their money's worth? And part of that, I think, would be to reorient universities towards the common good of Australians. And part of that will be people who will be more immune to anti-Semitism. You know, if people are brought up on a steady diet of woke doctrine or political correctness and cultural Marxism or whatever you might want to call these things, not only will they not be productive citizens, they're more likely to be anti-Semitic. So if we invest not just in education, but in the right sort of education, if we invest in truth and social responsibility, we're going to reap dividends. But that's a long-term project.
Yes. You mentioned about migration in the last discussion. For these two attackers, when we look at the father, he is still an Indian national on a visa in Australia, long term. And then we'll start have discussions that let's see who we are bringing into Australia. Now you shift to the son, and he was born in Australia.
Yes.
So now the conversation shifts from who do we let in to how do we monitor who's already here.
Yes.
How do you understand these two contrasting viewpoints?
Well, look, I think they go together. I mean, the reality is, and look, I think people have rightly raised questions about migration. to give an example, when Albanese, the Prime Minister, announced that they're going to bring in thousands of people from Gaza without proper vetting. I mean, that was lunacy. There was no real vetting of the people coming in. But there's also people who are here. And we've got to be careful about overgeneralizing. But the reality is that people who are in an environment in Australia where they might be exposed to harmful ideologies, we need to deal with that. And it's not a one-dimensional way of dealing with it. I think we need to be very aware of what the threats are. We need to be actively investigating those threats and then dealing with them. Where there's a difference, I think, is if people are actively engaged in this sort of hateful ideology and they're not citizens. Deportation is straightforward. And I think, as Andrew Hastie said, we should hit the deportation button. If they are citizens and they're being radicalised, well, depending on the extent of the radicalisation, and I certainly think early intervention is a lot more helpful than dealing with the results afterwards. But we can't be fearful anymore. I mean, if there is an institution that is preaching hatred, then it needs to be shut down, citizens or non-citizens. And if there's non-citizens, they can take their hate elsewhere. If they are citizens, then we have to apply the laws rigorously. And if I could put it this way, that religious hatred, religious hate speech, religious incitement of violence should be treated the same way that the Nazis have been treated lately. There should not be a difference there. But coming back to another thing, it should be a whole culture approach. So not just migration, not just religion, it should be the whole culture. And the reality is that, how would I put this? I believe in multiculturalism, real multiculturalism. I think Australia has, the words of Noel Pearson. We've got these three pillars. We've got the Aboriginal heritage, the British inheritance of law and government, and the multicultural future. The problem is that too many people who preach multiculturalism have never asked them one question: what is culture? And they have this relativistic lack of understanding. And so they're afraid to critique culture or to say, hey, this ideology is compatible with Australian culture, but this other one isn't. And again, I think that's a conversation we have to have. Look, Australian culture is a little bit like art. People have trouble defining it, but they recognise it when they see it. So I think that true leadership in Australia, and this is the leadership that we really need, is leaders who can stand up and say, here are authentic Australian values, this is authentic Australian culture. If you're an Australian, whether you are among our first Australians who've been here for tens of thousands of years, whether you've got off the plane yesterday, these are the values and the culture that we expect you to embrace. And we need to be proud about our culture. This is something that we're not seeing with our political leadership at the moment. And it's part of the education system where people have been trained to hate their culture, to be embarrassed about it. No, we should be proud of it. Has our Australian culture, is it perfect? No. Australia has done terrible things, yes. However, Australian culture is a net positive, and we need to be proud of that. That we have, I guess, one of the greatest countries in the world. We have freedom, we have equality, we have a stable democracy. Do you know how many countries survived intact throughout the entire 20th century? It's Australia, Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, was it New Zealand? And Switzerland. Oh, and the United States. Okay? Less than half a dozen countries survived the 20th century from January 1st, 1901 to 100 years later. Why? Are we the wealthiest country in the world? Are we the biggest? Are the best resourced? No. But we have a fantastic culture. And it's a culture that has got its foundations, but we've integrated the best of other cultures that have, from people who've made Australia our home. We need to be proud of that. And it needs to be something that we are prepared to defend. So that when people say, well, I don't like Australian values, instead of retreating behind this false facade of a wimpy wokeism or political correctness, we can have the courage and the pride to say, no, this is Australian culture. That sort of stuff is unacceptable. Maybe that's a long-term project, but that's what I want my children and grandchildren to inherit. A strong Australian culture of which we are very proud and prepared to defend, in which hatred and anti-Semitism are unthinkable. That's my hope.
As a migrant, when I every time see discussions on multiculturalism, there's only one culture which is always coupled with negative things. Australian culture. There was colonization, you did apartheid, you did racism, everything else but anything positive. So it's a strange thing where all multicultural champions can't solve this question. But anyway, as you said, it's a long-term project.
Well, and I also think that it depends on the lens that you look at Australia through. If you look at it through a left-wing Marxist perspective, then it's a horrible place. We did terrible things to the Aboriginal people. We had the White Australia policy, which I just add, as I wrote in The Spectator, it was the product of the union movement and the Australian Labor Party.
Yep.
Those things were horrible. But guess what? Australian culture has been strong enough and good enough that we've overcome those things. We do not have apartheid in this country. We were one of the first countries to give women the vote. Despite the horrible things that were done to Aboriginal people, they have equal voting rights and are counted in the census. And these are things that didn't happen despite Australian culture, but because of it. So, have we done terrible things? Yes. As Bill Maher said, human history is people being nasty to each other, whether you're of another religion, another race, whatever. History is full of people being horrible. But Australian culture, despite its faults, despite things that have happened in the past, is a net positive. The good far outweighs the bad. And if we are proud of that, if we recognise it, if our children are educated in the net positive of Australia, then that will make things like anti-Semitism unthinkable. That's just my humble opinion.
During this discussion around Bondi and multiculturalism and immigration, there has been a proposal from some quarters that we should now vet the migrants, not just first when they are coming in and the application process, but also from the point they come in till the point of their citizenship. As a professor of theology, do you actually think it is possible to screen for a person's soul or secret beliefs or anything? Or will it just end up being a big bureaucratic system where we'll get a false sense of security but actually achieve nothing?
Oh, look, one of my prayers is, Lord, save us from bureaucracy. But the reality is that you cannot look into the soul of a person, but you can look at their actions. Um, and I do think nowadays, one of the things about social media, for example, is you leave a footprint. So here's the question: when people apply to come to Australia and they are vetted, and maybe this is another thing, people do need to be vetted. If people come here on a tourist visa that they intend to use as a springboard to permanent residency, we need to look at our migration system there. Um, and this is a question, I don't know what the answer is. Do we look at people's social media? Do we look at their actions? Have they been part of anti-Semitic, anti-Western organisations? So I do think that a good level of vetting before people come to Australia is very, very important. There should be a next step, and that's when people have lived here and they apply for citizenship. We should also be rigorous in looking at people. And look, that could be as simple as looking at their social media. I'm actually a fan of the what they do in Switzerland. And I have a bias there. I'm partly Swiss. I think about 1/16th. When Switzerland's very generous with its with welcoming refugees, but once you want to apply for Swiss citizenship, when you want to go from being a guest to a citizen, they do things like they ask the people's neighbours, are they good neighbours? Are they good Swiss? Have they adopted Swiss culture and assimilated? And if they don't meet that, if people say, look, actually they hate Swiss culture, they don't get the citizenship. So I do think that we need to look at, in terms of our migration policy, um, to look at people very carefully, both when they apply to come to Australia and when they apply for a renewal of their visa or for citizenship. I don't think that's happening as much as it should be at the moment.
Uh, we talked and mentioned many times about anti Semitism. People always confuse this with anti Zionism. As a professor, how would you explain anti Semitism versus anti Zionism?
Well, look, I think that people who are academics, I mean, as an academic, I can make this joke that we're very good at splitting hairs and bringing complexity to something that is simple. I think it's actually a distraction when people say, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm just anti-Israeli. Well, really, you can make that distinction from an armchair. But let me go back to the Opera House protest. Those people were not chanting, let's criticize Israel. They were chanting, gas the Jews. If we look at the Hamas covenant, it doesn't just say they are anti-Israel. They talk about genocide of the Jews. So people can speak with a forked tongue, so to speak. They can claim that they're not really anti-Semitic. They're just Israel critical. I think that their actions and what happens in real life betray that. It's an excuse. It's a smokescreen. And hatred of Jewish people is so often covered up by people who claim, I'm not really against the Jewish people, I'm against Israel. That's the theory. The practice is quite different.
Towards closing, the Royal Commission is here, but before the Royal Commission gives the report, if you could sit down with the Prime Minister and the state leaders in the National Cabinet, what are the top 2 or 3 concrete actions you would ask to make the Jewish people feel safer in Australia?
Look, with the National Cabinet, so if I was talking to the premiers of Australia, most of them, not all, most of them have done a reasonable job. In Western Australia, premiers, well, the governments of both parties have been very good. Premiers in other states, I'd encourage them to either keep up what they're doing or to be stronger. As for the Prime Minister, the first thing I would say to him is, for the good of Australia, for the good of the Jewish people, for the good of all Australians, you must resign. I hate to say that, but Anthony Albanese is a horrible Prime Minister. He is a weak and ineffectual leader. His ideological outlook, in my opinion, is not suited to the Australian people. He has shown a dreadful lack of leadership after October 7. And in that criticism, I would include Foreign Minister Penny Wong. She claims not to hate Israel, but her actions betray her. The first priority of a government, of a Prime Minister, is to protect the Australian people. Everything else is secondary. The economy, education. If there are not Australian people to protect, the other things don't work. The Prime Minister and members of his cabinet have failed Australia. And I would do this, I would welcome the opportunity to sit down with the Prime Minister and say, I'm sorry, you have failed. You have no chance of redemption. You need to resign. And I would call on members of the federal government to put pressure on the Prime Minister to call a fresh election, to ask the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and let the people decide. I would ideally, with a government of either the Liberal or the Labor Party, for something as important as this, I'd want to work with them to say, this is what you could do better. These are the changes you need to make. This is how you can be a good leader. And I've got a history of doing that with members of government from a party that is not my own. When it comes to matters of national security, of state security, I will sit down and say, I really think this is what you need to do. And to their credit, they've taken it on board, sometimes disagreed with me. But I have faith in them that they'll do the right thing. Unfortunately, with this Prime Minister, with his history of support for a terrorist leader like Yasser Arafat, with his lack of action after October 7, and with his dreadful lack of response to Bondi, I cannot see any way in which Anthony Albanese is a viable Prime Minister. The one thing that he can do for the good of our country now is to resign. I believe that we should have Parliament dissolved and a fresh election. But the very least that he could do is to resign so that a decent person from the Labor Party can become Prime Minister. I hate to say that, but that's the reality. I can't see him doing any better.
With that advice, and with a big hope that the Royal Commission comes out with truth that we are all seeking, that what happened, whatever is the mandate and terms of reference are, and then from that report we can move forward all together. Thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure and honour. Thank you so much.